The lecture tonight will be given by Robert McCrumb, who has been working on what he has called the happiest experience of my writing career, this book, for the last 5 years. Prior to working on this book, Mr. McCrum published 5 works of fiction. His works have been filmed. He has been editor-in-chief at Faber Faber, where his authors included, and this is a fabulous list, Peter Carey, Adam Mars Jones, Maggie G., Paul Auster, Laurie Moore, Garrison Keillor, Milan Kundera, and on it goes. During the 1980s, he worked as a writer and a co-producer on The Story of English, which you may remember having seen. In 1995, he suffered a severe stroke, but he recovered to write My Year Off. That was published in 1998, and you may recall that excerpts of that were in The New Yorker, and I have to say, moved my friends and me to tears. We called around after reading that particular excerpt from his book, and we thought, how could this have happened to such an extraordinary young man? Well, the young man isn't quite so young tonight. He will stand before us, having survived that, having turned that personal event into a wonderful piece of writing, and now having turned the life of P.G. Wodehouse into a wonderful piece of writing. And I hope you join me in welcoming Robert McCrumb. Thank you. Now that we've given him the welcome, I am enjoined by Monica to say that the proceedings tonight are being filmed by C-SPAN, and so when we have the question and answer period a little later, please do stand if you have a question, and a microphone will be brought to you. And this evening's event is also being filmed by the WGBH Forum Network, so that if you miss a single word, a single syllable tonight, you can watch it on TV later. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you very much. I think this is the kind of club that Wodehouse would like to have been a member of. P.G. Wodehouse and I first met when I was about 10. At the time, I was at an English prep school, and I started with the Mike and Smith books, which made a lot of sense. Are you the bully, says Comrade Smith to Mike Jackson on first encounter, the pride of the school, or the boy who is led astray and takes to drink in chapter 16? With Mike, I was hooked. Bertie, Jeeves, Lord Emsworth and Mr. Mulliner would come later. Wodehouse, I think it's fair to say, became part of my unconscious, and indeed part of the unconscious of any English boy of my generation. About 5 years ago, however, when I wrote My Year Off, my book about my stroke, I found him creeping into the first chapter. His remark about the 2 ways to write a book seemed curiously apt. One, he said, in a famous sentence, is a sort of musical comedy without music. The other is going right deep down into life and not caring a damn. My Year Off was all about going deep down. By contrast, Wodehouse Alive has been much closer to musical comedy. When Wodehouse was in his prime as a writer in the 1920s and 30s, the Observer newspaper for which I work was one of his principal champions. So it's appropriate that Wodehouse Alive should have begun with the books pages of the Observer. On Sunday the 30th of May 1999, about 5 years ago, I wrote a column about the latest batch of Penguin's Wodehouse reissues. These were, I wrote, a selection of his best work that confirms him, I said, at the end of the century as a comic writer of sheer genius. Then I made a very serious gaffe. Alas, I concluded, there's never been a properly researched biography of the great man. Unbeknownst to me, at that very moment, Penguin Books was in the process of looking for a Wodehouse biographer. My article was passed back to the Wodehouse estate, and a few months later I found I was doing this job. And here we are. I confess I've never written a biography before, and I was nervous about it because Wodehouse is a national treasure the English feel rather proprietorial about. As a novice, I've become quite a student of biographical technique. Where do you start? What point of view do you adopt towards your subject? How do you relate the work to the life? And so on. My method is the method of the King of Hearts' advice to the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. Begin at the beginning, go on till you come to the end, then stop. That's not all, of course. There's a bit in one of the story collections, Very Good Jeeves, where Bertie Wooster says, the great thing on these occasions, as Jeeves will tell you, is to get a toehold on the psychology of the individual. Study the individual and you'll bring home the bacon. So I've been studying the individual and I hope I brought home the bacon. In my biography, I've made a point of never forgetting that first and last, Wodehouse is a sublimely funny writer. My Uncle George, says Bertie Wooster, discovered that alcohol was a food well in advance of modern enlightened thought. Of another uncle, he writes, Uncle Tom always looked a bit like a pterodactyl with a secret sorrow. While of Uncle Alaric, he says, few coots could have had less hair, and any walrus would have been proud to possess the moustache at which he was puffing. And I could spend most of tonight quoting from Wodehouse, and you'd be in stitches, and we would have a lovely evening, but it wouldn't get as much further forward in the life, so I'm going to carry on with the life. Genealogy is very important to Wodehouse. Bertie is always going on about William the Conqueror in the Middle Ages, and that's for one very good reason. Wodehouse is a funny English name with Anglo-Saxon roots, and belongs to a family that goes back almost as far as 1066. Famously, the name Wodehouse is not pronounced the way it looks. The first meaning of wood is related to trees, but a second derivation gives out of one's mind, insane, lunatic. Lysander in A Midsummer Night's Dream complains of being wood within this wood. There's also an obviously old English term, woodwose, meaning a wild man of the woods, a satyr, a faun. Not a bad beginning for a great humorist. He was born in England in 1881, the son of a colonial judge, and christened Pelham Grenville. This frightful label in his description came out as Plum or Plummy, which is how he's still known to serious Wodehouse fans across the world to this day. He was born in the same year as Picasso and Bartók, just after Einstein and E.M. Forster, the year before James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. He was part of a generation that would challenge every aspect of the world around them: music, language, perspective, even time itself. But Wodehouse was not a revolutionary, either by inheritance or temperament. His answer to the turmoil of his time was to escape, to create an English rural paradise, to give his devoted readers a lunatic version of their society. Families like the Wodehouses were the people who ran the country, who served as MPs, admirals, headmasters and district officers. As boys, they went to public schools, set up for their preparation in the duties of empire. As grown men, they enlisted in the Imperial Civil Service and joined clubs in Pall Mall, where they read the Times and relaxed over coffee, cigars and copies of Punch. In Punch, there are only three classes: the frivolous toffs, who wear top hats and put up with the lower orders; the respectable middle classes, who aspire to better things; and the H-dropping working classes, who chuck half bricks at the carriages of their superiors. This hierarchy was part of Wodehouse's unconscious inheritance. In his story, The Metropolitan Touch, he describes the audience for Bingo Little's village hall production of What Ho Twing as follows. The first few rows of the audience were occupied by the nibs. Then came a dense squash of what you might call the lower middle classes. At the back, we came down with a jerk in the social scale, this end of the hall being given up to a collection of frankly tough eggs. So first and last, Wodehouse was a Victorian English public schoolboy. As George Orwell, who was a lifelong fan, wrote in 1946, a thing that people often forget about P.G. Wodehouse's novels is how long ago the better known of them were written. Like many middle-class Victorians, and indeed like Orwell, Wodehouse grew up a kind of orphan. Up to the age of 15, he saw his mother for a total of 6 months. The first time he met her as a young boy, he thought she was just another aunt. She was, he said, virtually a stranger. I think this had three important, lasting consequences. First, the separation from his family made him solitary. Left to his own devices, he became an avid reader. He says somewhere that he read the Pope's translation of the Iliad when he was just 6. As a lifelong reader, he developed an instinctive taste for fantasy and a gift for rearranging reality to suit his purposes. Second, the absence of parental organisation and the loss of a stable family life made him look for routine. Throughout his adult years, he showed an abnormal attachment to routine: early rising, regular exercise, lunch and dinner at a certain time, a walk in the afternoon, the first cocktail, and so on. Thirdly, the pain of separation made him a master of English stoicism, the stiff upper lip. His childhood was fairly dreadful by modern standards. Wodehouse, pre-Freudian and deeply Victorian, says, "It went like a breeze from start to finish." The 3 essentials for an autobiography, he wrote, are that its author should have had an eccentric father, a miserable childhood, and a hell of a time at his public school. But I enjoyed none of these advantages. My father was as normal as rice pudding, and my school days at Dulwich were just 6 years of unbroken bliss. It was a childhood spent, apart from at school, in the company of aunts. Wodehouse's vision of aunts is not flattering. They are, he says, like mastodons bellowing across primeval swamps. His 2 most famous fictional aunts, the North and South Poles of Victorian auntliness, are Aunt Dahlia and Aunt Agatha, the pest of Pont Street. Aunt Dahlia, on the other hand, is the jolly one. According to Bertie, she guffawed more liberally than I have ever heard a woman guffaw. If there had been an aisle, she would have rolled in it. She gave the impression of a hyena who has just heard a good one from another hyena. Aunt Agatha, who was based on his mother's sister Mary, is altogether more imposing, with an eye like a man eating fish. Bertie says, "When I was a kid at school, she was always able to turn me inside out with a single glance." There's about 5'9" of Aunt Agatha, topped off with a beaky nose, an eagle eye, and lots of grey hair, and the general effect is pretty formidable. As Bertie says, "It is no use telling me that there are bad aunts and good aunts. At the core, they are all alike. Sooner or later, out pops the cloven hoof." And I think there's a good degree of his portrait of aunts taken from his mother as well as his actual aunts. In Uneasy Money, Wodehouse writes, "Boyhood, like measles, is one of those complaints which a young man should catch young and have done with." But his own boyhood is vital to an understanding of the mature man. He found his first real home at the age of 13 when he went to Dulwich. To him, the experience of boarding with other boys was unbroken bliss. In some ways, he never really grew up. As he said in 1947, "I'm a bad case of arrested development. Mentally, I seem not to have progressed a step since I was 18. When he wrote this, remember, he was a lissom young stripling of some 66 summers. And indeed, when people described meeting him all through his life, he was always described as being like a large boy. He was very tall, he was about my height, probably maybe a little bit taller, and large and fit. Every day of his life he did what he called the Daily Dozen, which was a selection of calisthenic exercises popularized after the First World War. He left Dulwich at the turn of the new century. The Boer War was at its height. Queen Victoria had just celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. At school, a clever boy with a precocious command of Latin and Greek, Wodehouse had been destined for Oxford, but it was not to be. His father, recently retired from the East and living on a rupee pension, said he could not afford it. He decreed that young Plum should earn a living. So, straight from school, Wodehouse went to work in the London branch of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, known today as the HSBC. It was a crushing blow, the cruel climax to a loveless childhood. Still, Wodehouse became utterly at home in the Edwardian metropolis. Wodehouse's London was a place where aristocrats chased actresses, where American money pursued British class, where bookmakers and barmaids mixed on equal terms with cabinet ministers. Once he started work in the city, it was a race against time. He had to establish himself as a freelance writer before the bank sent him out east to Hong Kong and the Far East. And these were the apprentice years, 1900 to 1902, when he developed the formidable daily writing routine that stayed with him to the end of his life. While working at the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, he had a lucky break. He got a job as a columnist on a London evening paper, The Globe. In 1902, he quit the bank and set out, as he put it, on my wild lone to make his name as a writer. He was happy on The Globe. The hours were ideal. Once he had filed his copy by the noon deadline, he was free to go home to work on his novel. He also learnt in the clatter of the newsroom the invaluable art of writing under deadline pressure in any environment. And to the end of his life, he retained an enviable facility for writing in the most difficult circumstances: ocean liners, boat trains, even, as it turned out, prison. So for the first 25 years of his life on his wild lone, he was first and foremost a journalist, motivated by deadlines or the promise of a cheque. The same month he left the bank, his first novel, The Pothunters, was published. It's still in print. That's almost exactly 100 years ago. He was just 21 years old. But he had yet to fulfill his ambition of going to the United States of America, which was to him the land of romance. And he didn't go to America for bookish reasons, but because he was a keen amateur boxer. At Dulwich he'd fought regularly in the amateur ring, and it was boxing, not books, that first brought him to the USA. He sailed the Atlantic in the spring of 1904 to see Kid McCoy fight Philadelphia Jack O'Brien in a heavyweight bout. He fell in love with America at first sight. To say that New York came up to its advanced billing, he once wrote, would be the baldest understatement. Being there was like being in heaven, without going to all the bother and expense of dying. After a month in New York, he returned to London, and he discovered that his trip had done wonders for his value as a freelance. I was a man who counted, he wrote. My income rose like a rocketing pheasant. As well as his American experience, it's important to stress Wodehouse's Edwardian Youth. As a young man, Wodehouse was steeped in the boys' writers of the age and addicted to the stories of Arthur Conan Doyle, published monthly in The Strand, and some say that the relationship of Jeeves and Wooster was inspired by Holmes and Watson. He was certainly determined to sell his work in New York as well as in London, and from 1904 to the end of his life, Wodehouse perfected the art of transatlantic trading, selling a literary version of America to British readers and an affectionate caricature of Britain to Americans. And both versions were filtered through the rosy spectacles of his imagination. This makes him, I think, rather modern. Wodehouse's talent for selling a version of Britain to America was emulated a century later by the makers of Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill. So Jeeves, the world-famous butler, actually made his first appearance in New York in 1916 in the Saturday Evening Post. I find it curious, Wodehouse once wrote, now that I have written so much about him, to recall how softly and undramatically Jeeves first entered my little world. On that occasion, he spoke just 2 lines. The first was, "Mrs. Gregson to see you, sir." The second, "Very good, sir. Which suit will you wear?" It was only some time later that the man's qualities dawned upon me, and I still blush to think of the offhand way I treated him at our first encounter. Jeeves takes his name from a Warwickshire county cricketer, the medium-paced bowler, that's a pitcher, Percy Jeeves, who was killed on the Somme in July 1916. As a gentleman's gentleman, Jeeves could not be further removed from the mud and slaughter of Flanders, and he was deeply Edwardian. Wodehouse had been exploring such a character in his fiction for many years, in writing about butlers. As a young boy, he said that he had lived on the fringe of the butler belt. A gentleman's gentleman, of course, is not a butler, but he's more than a mere valet. Jeeves is above and beyond such creatures. He is nothing if not unique. Jeeves is a nonpareil. Bertie Wooster tells his readers that Jeeves stands alone. There is, he says, none like you, none. I'm with Bertie. Personally, I can never tire of Jeeves. There's his absolute discretion. It was the soft cough of Jeeves's which always reminds me of a very old sheep clearing its throat on a distant mountaintop. There's his mysterious gift of movement. He never walks. Jeeves never walks. He floats, or pops, or filters, or pours silently into Bertie's presence. Jeeves entered, or perhaps I should say shimmered, into the room. And then there's his benign calm. Jeeves doesn't smile on these occasions, because he never does, but the lips twitch slightly at the corners and the eyes benevolent. Jeeves is always on hand to counsel and advise at the really crucial moments in Bertie's life. And it's worth saying en passant, I think, that Bertie is a unique figure. Bertie Wooster is a unique figure in the canon of English literature. I cannot think, I'd love to know if anyone here can think of a hero, a central figure in any major English fiction who is purely good, purely innocent. He is pure innocent. The worst he's ever done is steal a policeman's helmet. or puncture a hot water bottle with a stick with a darning needle on the end. The advent of Jeeves coincided with another turning point. In December of 1915, the first night of a Broadway musical, Wodehouse, marooned in New York during the First World War, bumped into an old friend from his Edwardian London days, the composer Jerome Kern, who was there with his writing partner Guy Bolton. In no time at all, Wodehouse and Bolton and Kern formed, in George Kaufman's phrase, the trio of musical fame. These three young men transformed the American musical into the form we know it today with a succession of hit shows, Leave It to Jane, Oh Lady Lady, and Sally, and many others. In 1917, Wodehouse had no less than 5 shows running on Broadway, a record that has never been surpassed, much to the irritation, I must tell you, of Sir Tim Rice. If by some mischance Wodehouse had been run over by a bus in the 1920s, his obituaries would have made much more of his work as a lyricist on Broadway than of his fiction. To a degree perhaps not sufficiently appreciated before, Wodehouse learnt much of his trade in the theatre. He had yet to find the colossal audience he achieved in the 30s. As I've said, he himself liked to describe his fiction as a sort of musical comedy without music. And I hope that my biography convincingly demonstrates the close connection between these American musicals and his best fiction. Once the Great War was over, Wodehouse was already an unofficial American living in Great Neck, a neighbour of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Enrico Caruso. For the next 20-odd years, he crisscrossed the Atlantic on the Cunard line like any business-class commuter. His work, though rooted in the English country house and the London club, also reflected Prohibition and the Jazz Age. It became infiltrated by American characters, senators, impresarios, bootleggers, and American slang, words like Ranny Gazoo, Hotsy Totsy, and Bum's Rush. Wodehouse lived and died in America, but travelled constantly all his life. Escaping from London, he experimented with the Riviera, went to Hollywood twice, and finally settled in Le Touquet with ultimately disastrous consequences. By the end of the 1920s, he was hugely rich and world famous. The New York Times reported his movements like a rock star. The climax to his Americanization came in 1930, when he was invited by MGM to write film scripts in Hollywood. He wrote, "It was an era when only a man of exceptional ability and determination could keep from getting signed up by a studio in some capacity or other. I happened to be engaged as a writer." He went out to California on a staggering salary of $100,000 for 6 months' work, several $1 million a day. He worked with George Gershwin, with the boy wonder Irving Thalberg, Fitzgerald's last tycoon, Fred Astaire, and many others. I must say that none of the films to which Wodehouse contributed are remembered today. But he did get something out of the experience. He transformed his adventures in Tinseltown into novels like The Luck of the Bodkins and comic fantasies like Laughing Gas. Wodehouse's Hollywood became as much an innocent paradise as Blandings or the Drones Club, populated by spendthrift English peers, power-hungry movie moguls, and dizzy blondes. At the same time, he never ceased writing brilliantly, as much for Americans as for Britons, about his private English fantasy world. And in 1938, he wrote what I think is one of his finest novels, The Code of the Woosters, which contains that immortal sentence, "He spoke with a certain what is it in his voice," and I could see that, if not actually disgruntled, he was far from being gruntled. In 1939, the year that war broke out, he was awarded a D.Litt from Oxford University, and he was about as famous as it was possible to be as a writer, more famous than any writer living today. His celebrity was just universal as an English humorist. But ironically, it was Wodehouse's American audience that was the ruin of him. In 1940, partly to avoid taxation and partly to be near his beloved Dulwich, he was living in a villa in Le Touquet, a French seaside resort just south of Calais and Dunkirk. When France fell in May 1940, Wodehouse was arrested as an enemy alien in occupied territory. Along with all the other English expats in France, he was sent to an internment camp in a former lunatic asylum in Upper Silesia in what is now Poland. Many internees were wrecked by the experience. Some went mad, others committed suicide, almost none was unscathed. But Wodehouse, the Victorian English stoic and ex-public schoolboy, simply thrived. Camp, he told a friend, was really great fun. As he said at the time, if this is Upper Silesia, who knows what Lower Silesia must be like? Despite the extraordinary privations, he kept up his routine and found comfort in his fantasy world. Remarkably, he completed Money in the Bank and started Full Moon during his interment. And his finest novel, for many, Joy in the Morning, was completed in Germany before the war ended. And what's fascinating about these books is that despite living through these terrible years in Nazi Germany, you cannot find in these books a reference, a simile, an allusion to what's going on. It's all the fantasy world. Or rather, there's probably one. I think I've identified one, which I've identified in my book, but there are very few. And anyone else, any other writer, having gone through that experience, I'm quite convinced would have found ways of alluding to what had happened to them in his or her work. Just before his 60th birthday, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, this is a technical point, he was released to Berlin from the camp. Now, in camp, his American fans, America at this point this is 1941, America was still a neutral country. It was not in the war. In camp, his many American fans had written to him by the score, and on his release in June 1941, to answer their letters and to reassure his public that he was alive and well, he made 5 radio broadcasts from Berlin. It was a terrible blunder, but Wodehouse, the Victorian, who saw European conflict as a kind of away match, never understood it. He never tried to blame anyone but himself. He wrote to a friend, "I made an ass of myself and I must pay the penalty." Looked at afresh today, the broadcasts are light, humorous descriptions of life in camp, not more. Here, for example, is the beginning of the talk entitled How to Be an Internee. Now, it's very important, I think, at this point to stress that when these broadcasts were first made in the last week of June 1941, the war was going about as badly for England and the Allies as it could possibly be going. The Germans appeared to be winning. The German army was sweeping through the Ukraine. The war in the Atlantic had gone very badly. America was not yet in the war, and so we were really up against it. And up pops Plum, P.G. Wodehouse in Berlin, with broadcasts of a frivolousness, breathtaking frivolousness. No wonder that people got upset. Here's the beginning of the first lecture. This was entitled How to Be an Internee. Young men starting out in life have often asked me, how can I become an internee? Well, there are several methods. My own was to buy a villa in a Touquet on the coast of France and stay there until the Germans came along. This is probably the best and the simplest system. You buy the villa, the Germans do the rest. Even his account of the Wehrmacht in Le Touquet, which was endlessly quoted against him, shows evidence only of a comic writer trying to get a laugh. I was strolling on the lawn with my wife one morning when she lowered her voice and said, "Don't look now, but there comes the German army." And there they were, a fine body of men, rather prettily dressed in green, carrying machine guns. And much more to the same effect. Not a word pro or anti the regime, just jokes about camp life. His mistake was not what he said, but that he allowed himself to appear on Nazi radio at the very moment Germany appeared to be winning the war. There was an international outcry. The British press particularly launched a witch hunt, and disgrace followed swiftly. It was impossible to return to Britain, and he spent the rest of the war first in Berlin and then in Paris. Finally, in the spring of 1947, he sailed for New York, an outcast and an exile. In America, he completed the mating season, and this marked the end of his golden period. the golden period which had begun in roughly 1929 with summer lightning and heavy weather. For many years after the war, he wrestled with his craft. As he wrote in one of the introductions to his post-war work, "The world of which I have been writing since I was so high has gone with the wind. It is one with Nineveh and Tyre. In a word, it has had it." Wodehouse settled in the Hamptons on the south shore of Long Island. He became, in his own words, Squire Wodehouse of Remsenburg. Slowly, he resumed his career as a humorist. But for the rest of his life, he could never escape the accusations of treachery, and even now his name guarantees farcical frivolity, but it also connotes, quite unfairly, dubious collaborationism and pro-fascist sympathies. And I stress this point because while I was working on this book, people would say to me, "What are you doing?" And I'd say, "I'm writing a biography of P.G. Wodehouse." And they'd say two things. They always said the same two things. First of all, they'd say, "That must be a lot of fun," which of course is true. It's also a lot of work. And then they would say, "Wasn't he a traitor, a collaborationist, a fascist, a Nazi?" So some version of that lie has been perpetrated, and it stuck to him. Three influential English friends, writers, did their best to acquit him of the charges of pro-fascist sympathies. Malcolm Muggeridge said, "It wasn't that he was otherworldly or unworldly as much as that he was aworldly. Wodehouse's true offence was to have disinterested himself in the war." George Orwell wrote a long and famous essay in defence of P.G. Wodehouse, which has never been bettered. Orwell wrote, "The idea that in 1941 he consciously aided the Nazi propaganda machine is untenable and ridiculous. His moral outlook was that of a public schoolboy, and according to the public school code, treachery in time of war is the most unforgivable of all sins." And finally, there's Evelyn Waugh, who made a broadcast on the BBC on Wodehouse's 80th birthday entitled "An Act of Atonement and Reparation." And it's a famous passage which I'll read to you because I think it expresses so much about him. "For Wodehouse, there has been no fall of man, no aboriginal calamity. His characters have never tasted the forbidden fruit. They are still in Eden. The gardens of Blandings Castle are that original garden from which we are all exiled. The chef Anatole prepares ambrosia for the immortals of high Olympus. Mr. Wodehouse's world can never stale. He has made a world for us to live in and delight in." He worked to the very end of his life. He wrote every day of his life and he worked to the end of it. His last unfinished novel, Sunset at Blandings, was found by his bedside after his death, aged 93, on St. Valentine's Day, 1975. Work in progress from a committed writer. His massive Victorian tombstone is inscribed with the names of his most famous creations: Smith, Bertie Wooster, Jeeves, Lord Emsworth and Mr. Mulliner. And he's buried, not in Britain, but on the south shore of Long Island, an American citizen. It is now a generation since Wodehouse's death, and a succession of new Wodehouse landmarks is in view, the 100th anniversaries of his first books. Books like The Pothunters, Love Among the Chickens, Mike, Something Fresh, the list goes on and on. They're all in print, remarkably, and they're still admired by a new generation. Today, the wartime scandal, seen in a longer perspective, no longer clouds the reader's approach to his work. It can be seen as a disastrous blunder that reflects on the author, but not on his books. His fame will never again reach the peaks of the 30s, but his comic vision has an absolutely secure place in the English literary imagination. To have created not one, but as many as 5 great characters, Bertie, Jeeves, Lord Emsworth, Aunt Agatha and Smith, who require no introduction, places him in a very select group of writers led by Shakespeare and Dickens. And some enthusiasts have tried to compare him to these writers. But the comparison, in my view, does not really fly. Wodehouse was a miniaturist. His work is not like theirs. In many ways, Wodehouse is much closer in spirit to Jane Austen. Like her, Wodehouse placed his characters in a just vanished society, but one, moreover, whose reality was transformed by his remarkable powers of fantasy and imagination into something timeless and permanent. The secret of that permanence lies in Wodehouse's surreptitious elegy for his country. Behind the drones in the Manor House weekends is a sweet, melancholy nostalgia for England of innocent laughter and song. And it is for this reason, I believe, that Wodehouse's work has an undisputed place in the canon of English literature. His writing is less vulnerable to fashion than many other 20th century contemporaries, but as popular comedy, it is likely to be undervalued. Wodehouse understood this. Humorists, he wrote towards the end of his life, are looked down upon by the intelligentsia. And his work, I think, will continue to suffer the fate of so much light comic writing. It will rarely be treated with the seriousness it deserves, or with the seriousness accorded to many lesser writers. But Wodehouse would not be dismayed. For him, the lightness was all. Seriousness was risky. Seriousness meant raising too many painful questions, either about himself or about his society. Seriousness was about finding answers, which were troubling things with painful consequences. Probably he sensed that there were no answers. Enigmatic and elusive in his own life, he was happy to let things remain a mystery. In lightness and lunacy, existence could be bearable, and the unexamined life, left to its own devices, could go like a breeze. Especially if crowded with incident, orchestrated by butlers and valets, and dedicated to helping old pals. Ignoring the big questions, then, it was also Wodehouse's genius to execute the lightness of his stories in a language that danced on the page like poetry, marrying the English style of the academy with the English slang of the suburbs, with a sprinkling of American English thrown in. But the lightness is also a sleight of hand. Behind the comic mayhem of Wodehouse's best work, horrifying as it may seem for those for whom his work is a blessed escape from seriousness and difficulty, there is, I believe, an inspiration that gives it significance. Deprived in childhood of parental affection and unable fully to express it in his own life, Wodehouse's lasting subject is universal, the foibles of the human heart. Take away the Aberdeen Terriers, the cocktail shakers, the banjos, the tartan spats, the pigs, the frantic telegrams, and the quest for human connection is the whirring flywheel that keeps the intricate clockwork of his plots ticking and makes his world go round. Wodehouse is often described as an innocent, and so he was in many, many, many ways, but with the innocence came an exceptional good nature and a profound humanity. He believed in doing what he called the square thing by his fellow man, and in an understated tolerance of human frailty. His biggest trouble, the terrible wartime blunder, sprang from the best of motives, the expression of gratitude to readers who liked his work. And beyond that, then, there is the work, an extraordinary body of English prose, novels, stories, poems, films, plays, reportage, correspondence, memoir, that give him consequence. Successive generations of readers will return again and again to his books, to admire his inimitable gifts, to laugh at the follies of the human comedy, and to celebrate the magic of an English prose caught at a singular moment between mass culture and high art. In the lives of most great writers, there are usually two lasting themes: love and work. With Wodehouse, these are indistinguishable, and both prevail. Thank you. We're now going to do Q&A. I'm sure there may be one or two questions, and the guys at the back are keen for there to be a hiatus. Is that right? Yes, a hiatus while we work out how we do this.
There's to be just a moment's pause while C-SPAN organizes itself, and while you organize yourselves to think of your questions, if you'll also plan to stand, a microphone will be brought to you so that we can hear the question and record it.
I have a question about when Jeeves first sets upon the scene. I thought he was sent from the agency and immediately prepares the hangover drink. I don't remember the words you originally quoted about his first appearance. Was that a different episode?
Different story.
Oh.
I knew this was going to happen. The thing about Wodehouse's work is it tends to blur in the mind somewhat, and there are, of course, about 100 books and many Jeeves stories, but I think he does indeed supply a hangover cure, but not in that first story. But the point that he was making is that he used him as a walk-on character in the story Extricating Young Gussie in 1916. I think that was when it was. It was only later on that he realised his immense value to the narrative. And then indeed he came out with The Hangover Cure, which is a wonderful... If somebody's got a copy of the book, I will read you The Hangover Cure. It is a great... I would like to do that, actually. It's one of the great passages. This is Jeeves' Hangover Cure. One of the things I'm trying to do in this book is I'm trying to reclaim him as a great English... Wodehouse as a great English stylist. For whom every word was always in the right place. And The Hangover Cure, which comes in the 20s bit, find it, was, as you rightly say, was one of the first things that Jeeves does for his master. This is Jeeves' famous pick-me-up after a hard night out. For perhaps the split part of a second, nothing happens. It is as though all nature waited breathless. Then suddenly, it is as if the last trumpet sounded and Judgment Day set in with unusual severity. Bonfires burst out in all parts of the frame. The abdomen becomes heavily charged with molten lava. A great wind seems to blow through the world, and the subject is aware of something resembling a steam hammer striking in the back of the head. And then, just as you are feeling that you ought to ring up your lawyer and see that your affairs are in order before it is too late, the whole situation seems to clarify. The wind drops, the ears cease to ring, birds twitter, brass bands start playing, the sun comes out over the horizon with a jerk, and a moment later, all you are conscious of is a great peace. It's a brilliant bit of writing. And that's just one little snippet. Well, thank you for the questions.
Are there any characters in Wodehouse's novels that you think are particularly autobiographical, either characters he identified with or characters he would have liked to have been?
I think he always thought he was Lord Emsworth. He does say, he's always laying false clues, but there's enough in that statement, and I could back that up with evidence. And if you want to become very analytical, I think the obsession with the pig could stand with I didn't bring a pig today, I'm sorry about that. The obsession with the pig could be made to stand for the obsession with the work. And I think he certainly liked, like Lord Emsworth, he liked to wear old clothes, slop about the house, not worry too much about the outside world, and to be detached from the worries of the world. So I think the answer would be Lord Emsworth, although in some of the earlier the school stories, you can have a strong sense of the young Wodehouse. But I think in later life, Lord Emsworth would be the answer to that question. Question over there.
Thank you. There's a character in his books which is a really lovely and sporting young woman, and she appears in a lot of the stories. And I wonder, was there ever anyone like that in his life?
I think what happened, I didn't go into his marriage, but he had a very interesting marriage. He married Ethel Newton. She was 20. She said she was 29. It turns I've discovered actually she was 28. She just shaved a year off her age on the wedding the wedding license. He married a woman who had been married twice before. Her first husband had died of cholera in India. The second husband committed suicide. But anyway, she had a daughter, Leonora, and incredibly, when Wodehouse married Ethel in New York in 1914, he hadn't met the daughter. The daughter was at school in England. It was very strange, the whole thing. Leonora was at school in England, and he didn't meet her for some months to come. But when he did meet her, he sort of fell in love with her. It was a great relationship, and I think he was as close to Leonora as he was to anybody. And I think what you find in the novels, particularly the 20s, is the female characters who are, let's face it, largely cardboard cutouts initially. They're not three-dimensional. Become much more interesting, and that reflects, I think, his closeness to Leonora. Leonora, you may remember, was the dedicatee of a famous collection of stories, where he said, "To my daughter Leonora, without whose unfailing help and assistance, this book would have been finished in half the time." I think what that means is that she was his first reader, and she would read the stuff and give him comments. And I don't think he needed much editing, but she would give him feedback on his work. And she died tragically in 1944 during the war. It was again part of Wodehouse's dreadful war. I didn't go into that either, but it was it's an episode of great sadness. There's another one behind you, sir.
Sweet. Do you think any of his books that he wrote after the Second World War rose still to the level of the books he wrote in the late 20s and into the 30s?
I couldn't hear the first part, sorry.
Do you think that any of the books he wrote after the Second World War rose to the levels that he did in the late 20s and 30s?
No, I think, I must say, I may be heretical on this. I think the late books are weak, and I deal with them rather briskly. I mean, I don't go into them, really. I think they're inferior, really. He is really just at times coming close to plagiarizing himself and working old themes. And they're not fresh. They have a charm, a autumnal charm, but they're not the great works by any means. I think, as your question implies, I think that's what I would think.
If there are no more questions, we invite you to join Mr. McCrum out in the room adjacent where the Globe bookstore from Harvard Square has his book for sale. And, of course, there's wine and cheese. And thank you once again very, very much.